Good morning. Thank you, Alfreda. And I'm Catherine Cuellar. I am a personal fan of Alfreda's artful, thoughtful leadership, and it is my honor to start my week and kick off Big Bang with my friends at SVP Dallas this morning. I first spoke at Big Bang with Jenna Bush Hager and Jennifer Staubach Gates in 2013, and this year's lineup is the most inclusive and equitable yet. I'm so glad we are able to be united through tech this morning, and yet, in part because of technology, many of us have never felt more isolated from our families, our neighbors, and our fellow Texans. What defines us and our fellow Texans is what our speakers this morning are here to help us consider and deepen through intentional connections. While Texas has afforded all of us here today incredible opportunity, our sense of unity as Texans has never felt more threatened. And yet, what keeps us here in Texas is not what divides us, but what unites us. My friends at More in Common won my heart and captured my imagination with that premise. I first met their founder, Mathieu Lefebvre, in Dallas during the New Cities Summit in 2014. He went on to found More in Common, a global anti-polarization nonprofit, in response to growing threats of violence over our perceived differences. After nationwide studies overseas and in the United States, their first provincial study was here in the Lone Star State, and I couldn't be prouder to introduce their pivotal research. What they found is not entirely surprising. Within and beyond the USA, Texas's reputation precedes us, and I have found my fellow Texans from coast to coast and around the world like needles in a haystack. As my dad, who wasn't born here but got here as fast as he could, likes to say, if we Texans don't stick together, we have nothing. The threads of Texas weave a beautiful tapestry, and now I will let Dan Valone, the U.S. Director of More in Common, tell you more.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Really appreciate the chance to speak with everyone today. I'm Dan Valone. I'm the U.S. Director for More in Common. So I lead the work specific to the U.S. As Catherine mentioned, More in Common works as part of a global initiative with teams in France, Germany, and the U.K. I'm also excited to have the chance to speak with you all today because I had the pleasure of living in Texas for about a year and a half when I was stationed at Fort Hood. So always wonderful to reconnect with Texans. So as Catherine mentioned, the Threads of Texas was our first state-level study. And we'll get into the research methodology behind this, but I'm going to first just kick things off with the agenda to show you what we're going to cover in our conversation today. So we'll do a brief introduction to More in Common, to the research, then we'll cover the Threads of Texas, the 7 segments that we identified in our research. We'll break down some key issues that are in headlines today and show you how the threads weigh in on those issues. Then we'll take a deep dive on Texan identity, and we'll close with talking about how to apply this work. All of More in Common's work is designed to try and help bring people together across lines of difference and reduce some of the intensity in the issues we see dividing people. So the next slide just shows briefly a little bit about More in Common. Catherine covered this pretty well, so I'll just underscore that we are a 501c3 nonprofit here in the U.S. We do a lot of public opinion research. That is, our core research is applying innovative findings from social psychology into public opinion research to help us better understand the issues and values and beliefs which are animating the division we see in our societies, and the beliefs, values, and identities which we believe can bring people together in unexpected ways. And then we work with partners to try and lift up narratives that unite people and strategies that bring people physically together or via technology in ways that reduce the sense of division. I'm going to start next with some top-line findings that might speak to the moment. I imagine many folks in the audience will resonate with these findings, but we found in a large statewide survey we did in 2020 that 83% of Texans were exhausted by the division they saw in politics, and 87% are concerned it will lead to violence. 9 in 10 Texans are concerned about the risks of political violence due to division. And that makes sense. Here in this next slide, we show just a quick sample of headlines that we pulled from some newspapers, Texas Tribune, Dallas Morning News. And there are real divisions in Texas. There are real divisions in the country more broadly. And those divisions have in many ways become even more visceral in the past few years, where you see groups lining up along every issue, and it can feel as though the entire state is divided into two monolithic camps that are divided on every issue and increasingly willing to condone aggressive behavior, confrontational tactics, and worryingly, trend lines towards violence. So that sense of exhaustion, that sense of fear, that makes sense. That division is there in Texas. We did find that. But that's not the full story that we found. And so the next slide just shows the Threads of Texas research. So this is our project in Texas. It is ongoing, and it is an effort for us to try and help elevate a more complex and nuanced picture of Texas. So if you could imagine that there is that very real division, two sides lined up almost on every issue, and it is getting worse. But if you zoomed out and saw a map of Texas, you'd see people doing many other things, and oftentimes they would be doing those things together across some of these fault lines. And so while we can't dismiss or don't want to understate the real risks from that sense of division and from those issues that are dividing Texans, we want to see the full picture. And so with the Threads of Texas, what we did is we have done two large statewide surveys. So in one survey, we reached 4,000 Texans. We put it in English and Spanish, so the sample is very representative of the state. And we sought to identify who Texans are beyond the standard categories that we use in public opinion research to categorize people, so race, demographics, party ID. We sought to understand them through the lens of Texas identity, and in particular, their perceptions and attitudes towards changes in Texas. And so you can see on the next slide, more specifically, in green, those are the boxes of variables that we used to create what ultimately proved to be 7 distinct categories of Texans. So my colleague Noel will get much more in depth on this, but you can see that we used people's responses to questions about Texan identity, their attitudes towards change, their feelings towards Texas, and the level of political engagement as the variables to organize populations. We didn't use the standard demographics or political ID. And then we also, in the same set of surveys, we asked people about some of these key issues: immigration, COVID, race, democracy, education. And the picture that we found, as I mentioned earlier, is one that shows a lot more nuance than standard ways of understanding people. So in the next slide, we show a headline issue, which we asked, do you feel as though Confederate Civil War monuments are symbols of Southern pride or symbols of the country's history of racism? And you can see on average, the state of Texas is split 53-47, so close to 50-50. And conventional ways of understanding this division reinforce this picture of the state being divided into two groups. So here we break it down and we show the same question organized around Democrat or Republican, or around Black Texan and white Texans. And you can see very stark divides between those 4 groups. And we are also putting on the side, you can see the percentage of those groups which are individuals who describe themselves as Hispanic. And so when the picture becomes more complex when we use the segmentation that More in Common produced through our research. So here we're withholding the names. Noel's going to get into the names of these segments, but here we just show 4 threads and how individuals in those threads answer this question about Confederate Civil War monuments. And you can see right off the bat, thread 1 and thread 7, very opposing views. 91% of thread 1 feeling as though the monuments are symbols of the country's history of racism, 82% of thread 7 feeling that they are symbols of Southern pride. Those 2 threads, as we'll discover, animate the most vitriolic kind of divides in the state. And then you can see in thread 2 and thread 4 that there's just a more muted response to the question. There's more complexity, there's more nuance when we look at this issue across those 4 threads. And you'll also note the distribution of individuals who identify as Hispanic. It's interesting across all 4 threads. So what this shows for us and what we have found consistently is by using these threads, we actually can capture a more accurate level of understanding about why people feel the way towards certain issues. And we can get a much more accurate sense of individuals and groups that are animating politics in Texas. And I'm going to kick things over to my colleague Noel now to take you through who those groups are.
All right. Thank you, Dan. So here's a quick snapshot of the 7 threads with their names. You'll see the adjectives and the statements that best describe them, but I'll get into each one a little bit closer. But just to say that what distinguishes these threads from each other is their distinct orientation toward change and really their perception of opportunities for them in the future, which is what we find is underlying a lot of divisions and just debate around issues, is really this orientation around this rapidly changing Texas and what it means for them personally. So the first thread I will talk about is the Lone Star Progressives. So the ideal Texas of Lone Star Progressives is one where all Texans of all races, faith, and backgrounds feel safe and feel like they belong. So they are excited about opportunities they will have. However, they are very pessimistic toward the future of Texas society. This is not surprising given their very strong liberal views. They feel alienated in Texas because they do not identify with what they perceive are the more patriotic, liberty-centric aspects of Texan identity. And so they are politically engaged, they are well-educated, relatively well-off, high socioeconomic status. And you'll see here from this quote by Lone Star Progressive Ruby, they just have this sort of negative outlook towards the direction Texas is heading. So the next thread is a larger thread. So Lone Star Progressives comprised 14% of Texans. Civic Pragmatists make up about a fifth of the Texan population. And their name suggests really the most salient features of who they are. They're optimistic, yet pragmatic when they think about the changing Texas. So civic pragmatists are politically diverse, they're informed, they're engaged. They are concerned with issues of inequality, but in their orientation toward these issues, they are practical rather than ideological. So they seek compromise closer to the political center. I think as articulated very well by this quote here, where Greg was talking about immigration, and realizing the different angles of this issue. All right. The next thread is the thread we're calling the Rising Mavericks. So just as a note, Dan showed the variables that went into this hierarchical cluster analysis for these segments to come out. And in that cluster analysis, we did not include age or any demographic variables. But interestingly, Rising Mavericks, about more than 60% of them identify as Gen Z. And so they are the youngest and most ethnically diverse segment that we have. About a third are immigrants. These are Texans who are optimistic and believe that the future of the state will be determined by pioneers and entrepreneurs. They have a sense of financial precarity, but at the same time, a strong sense of upward mobility for themselves. And so they are young, multicultural, they're racially diverse, and you can see here that about half feel excited about the rapid pace of change in Texas. These are students or Texans that are just starting out, so there's that anxiety and ambivalence, but also a sense of excitement. Rising Mavericks are proud Texans, but for them, this Texan pride is not exclusive and can have room for the ability to look at the history critically. And so the majority actually believe that Texans should be able to do this, so balance the positive and the negative when thinking about Texas history. One last thing about Rising Mavericks, they are the hardest to pinpoint politically. They are politically diverse, full of nuances and uncertainty, and as the name suggests, they are not afraid to voice their opinions. Okay, so the next thread we have about a little more than 1 in 10 Texans identify as apolitical providers. So apolitical providers are Texans that are the most worried about being left behind. They are most likely to be of low income, and they are very apprehensive about the future. And so they feel generally detached from civic life and are the least likely to engage in political activities. Only 15% of eligible voters, for example, in this group voted in the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections. They are ambivalent about the drivers of change. And importantly, however, this disconnect does not stem from an animosity toward politics, but it's really from being occupied with more concrete day-to-day concerns. And so this quote here by Helen conveys a sense of why all the systems in here and all the rhetoric and debates are there, but they don't feel that in their personal daily lives. All right, and so our fourth group, or fifth now, are the group we're calling die-hard Texans. So die-hard Texans are distinctly optimistic about the future of Texas society. They are Texans that are deeply connected with their communities, and their optimism is rooted actually in this fierce Texan pride and a sense of defensiveness toward the history and the present state of Texas. They are also about the same income level as apolitical providers, relatively lower compared across all Texans, and about half in this group are Hispanic Texans. Most diehard Texans, as the name would suggest, believe that America would be better if it were more like Texas. And while they recognize that Texas can be home to people moving into the state, they really feel that to be truly Texan, one has to be invested and raised in Texas. Overall, diehard Texans lean conservative, although they are a group that's not actively engaged in state politics. They are much more attuned to their local communities, but this does not translate to political engagement. All right. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so Reverend Texans is the next Texas thread, also a relatively larger thread. And a note here for their name, we find that across all Texans, or most Texans, faith plays a critical and multifaceted role. Around 70% of Texans say religion is important in their lives. This is regardless of ideological belief or psychological orientation. Reverend Texan is what we choose to name this group because they are likely to say religion is central in their identity and central in their Texan identity. They also have the highest church attendance rate compared to others. So Reverend Texans are Texans that are optimistic and proud. And compared to other Texans, they are relatively enthusiastic about the future, also buying into that idea that an ideal Texas is one that proudly upholds its traditional values, and that an economically successful Texas is one that is distinguished by pioneers and individual thinking. All right. Finally, the last thread of Texas we have is the Heritage Defenders. So Heritage Defenders is another conservative segment similar to Reverend Texans. But unlike Reverend Texans, which is that thread that I showed just before this, Heritage Defenders are less optimistic about the future of the state and their place in it. So 4 out of 10 say that they are worried they will be left behind. And as their name suggests, their whole orientation is defending this idea of an ideal Texas in the past. Heritage Defenders value individualism and personal responsibility. They are politically engaged, but have a strong sense of skepticism toward the government. And so they really construe Texas and this idea of Texanness as an idea to be preserved and sort of a fixed identity that newcomers have to adapt to. There is a sense of feeling embattled in this group. They are exhausted from polarization and just think that Texas today is losing its past, which made it Texas. And so important, as Paul describes how these groups fall into the following key issues, is that Reverend Texans and Heritage Defenders, for example, are two conservative threads. They will show up the same in a ballot box, but the motivations behind their vote may be very different. All right. And so that was a lot of information for each of the threads. And before we move on to the key issues, we wanted to do a quick poll. And we are curious. You can take the quiz on the website if you already have. You can answer this more accurately. But which thread do you think best describes you? And hopefully, Emily or Julia can pull up that poll now. I don't think we are seeing a poll. Okay. We can probably save it at the end as well. All right. Okay, well, I don't think the poll is pulling up on our end, and I think on your end as well. So we'll go ahead and I'll turn the slides over to Paul, who will talk about the key issues. And then at the end, we'll circle back, and by then, it's an even more complete picture, so we can figure out where you think you land on the threads of Texas. And so over to you, Paul.
Great. And it looks like the poll might have just gone up, so I can sort of talk over while folks are looking at that. But I think I'm just going to go ahead and set the stage here, but I'm going to, as Noel said, talk about some of the key research findings. So there's more specific data points related to the economy, democracy, energy, and the environment. So this was from our sample, our large-scale 4,000 sized survey of Texans, and then a follow-up sample in March following the winter storm in Texas. So within this research, okay, I got a little message from Noel to tell me to hold up, so I'll just stop for a second.
Yeah, I think the poll is running just now, and it'll probably like a few more seconds. Oh, interesting. Okay, so we are seeing the results, and it looks like majority or many are in the Lone Star, Progressive, and Civic Pragmatists bucket. It's very interesting, and that's not at all surprising. All right. I think we should be good to go now, Paul.
Great, thanks. Super interesting results. We've done this a couple times and have had different results each time. So this is super fascinating to see the poll come up. So yeah, we can go ahead and go to the next slide, but basically I'm just going to be using the Texas Threads framework that Noel and Dan laid out to talk about some of the deep divisions and also big points of commonalities, with a lot of the divisions reflective of how Texans perceive the future and their role in it. So this was a question about sort of the spirit of individualism and how it relates to business in the future of Texas. So we asked a binary question here with those two answer choices on the top on whether this risk-taking pioneering spirit or a more collectivist approach would define the Texas of the future. You can see here that the split seems pretty clear down the middle, 50-50. However, when you look at the threads, it paints such a more nuanced picture. There seems to be an ideological split, especially with the Lone Star Progressives, compared to the more religious and conservative threads. But as you can see in the middle, a lot of the threads, Rising Mavericks and Civic Pragmatists are more varied in their opinions. So yeah, I think one of the interesting pieces is that Rising Mavericks here, that younger group that Noel laid out, is slightly more towards the risk-taking, individualist pioneering spirit. But I think kind of more broadly, this is evidence that when looking towards the future, Texans believe that businesses have agency and power to actually enact change. we also asked a related question regards to the future of the Texan economy, this time asking whether they think, the more traditional oil and gas industries are the key to Texas's future economy, or knowledge-based industries such as, tech or health. So the scores here have sort of a slightly clearer ideological breakdown, as you can see sort of the waterfall effect here with, 89% of Lone Star progressives thinking that knowledge-based industries are the key to the state's future success as it relates to the economy. Whereas, Reverend Texans, that more religious group, and heritage defenders think the opposite, think that some of the more traditional industries still will define the future. And it's interesting to look at some of the more centrist or groups in the middle who are a little bit more disengaged, who do think that knowledge-based industries are the key to Texas's future economic success. So now on to the question of the role of businesses in Texas's democracy and what businesses or Texans think that businesses might be able to do. This is, of course, a pretty salient issue in Texas and in the country more broadly today. But what our research tells us, and if you look at this graph here, each of the dots represents a Texas thread by a different color, with the average indicated by a diamond. You'll see that there's really high agreement on each of these 4 specific issues on the bottom there. So on the left hand, the y-axis represents the percent agreement with each of these specific issues. But despite a lot of disagreements on some of those issues of, risk-taking or a common Texas goal, or oil and gas versus, knowledge-based industries, Texans do believe that businesses can help employees when it comes to voting. So pretty high majorities across, again, each of the 7 threads, so above 50%, believe that businesses should allow employees to take off time to vote on election day, encourage employees to vote, not pressure employees to vote for a certain party or candidate, and simply help employees to register to vote. So these findings speak to the potential role of business in fostering civic engagement and suggest that Texans want to vote and welcome the opportunity to do this. So back in March, as probably many of y'all recall, and I do as someone who went through this in Austin, we asked a series of questions about the winter storm in Texas in early March of this year. So these questions were fielded immediately after the winter storm, aimed to assess how Texans are thinking about energy and the environment. So again, on the left side, the y-axis represents percent agreement with each of those statements on the bottom. So most Texans recognize that, this weather crisis in March taught us that no matter our political beliefs as Texans, we have to rely on each other and work together. And in addition to that, so above 50% agreement on both of these, the winter storm and power grid failure showed us that Texans need a stronger energy system, even if that requires more regulation. So even those more conservative or religious groups, such as Reverend Texans or heritage defenders, agree with that second sentiment. So we can go to the next slide. So even though we see that there is an appetite for change across each of the Texas threads, at least in issues related to energy, when we look more broadly about the environmental movement, what emerges is a barrier for Texans to make change in this field. So in this question, we asked, the environmental movement, does it care about the well-being of people like me? We found that the majority of Texans don't believe that, or they do believe that the environmental movement doesn't care about them. So again, we have some outliers here with Lone Star progressives who do agree with this, but who disagree. It's a little bit of a confusing double negative here. But yeah, Reverend Texans and heritage defenders, as well as the majority of Texans, have mixed opinions on whether they belong in the environmental movement. So I think with that, I'm going to just have a few more slides here on a shared Texan identity. So we talked a lot about, specific survey questions that have to do with issues in the future of Texas. And there is a lot of disagreement, but in our research, it shows how there can be a shared identity that underlies disagreements and debates so that issues don't remain at a stalemate. So in this last section here, we're going to talk about the power of Texan identity and the shared DNA of what it truly means to be Texan. So this was a question we fielded that said, when I think of Texas, I think of blank, and we gave those options at the bottom. So again here, the dots represent each of the 7 threads, and that little tiny Texas-shaped dot is the Texas average. And again, the percentages represent their level of agreement with each of those items below. So what we find here is that there's really broad agreement on each of these issue areas that, when it comes to when they think of Texas, they think of Texas's history as a place of immigrants, of its vastness and unique natural beauty, of the diversity of people, language, food, and music, and opportunities for people who want to work hard and make something of themselves. So as you can see, some of these items have tighter clusters than others. There's more agreement. There's, a few outliers here, but for each of these, there's above 50% support and agreement that Texans associate each of these things with what it means to be Texas. We can go to the next slide. So this is a similar question, but we focused a little bit here more on the values and core beliefs of Texans. So we asked about, which of these are important to being truly Texan. So again, this measures percent agreement with each of these values. So all of these threads embrace a love of freedom, equality, diversity, and neighborliness as core to the Texan identity. You can see that the points around the items are clustered relatively tightly. So being a risk taker is rated a bit lower, reflected some of those findings that we showed earlier about Texas's future economy. And in addition, most Texans don't resonate with the part of being Texas means being white. So we can go to the next slide. So finally, we asked about Texans' aspirational vision for the state. And for the most part, an ideal Texas for Texans is one where everyone belongs. And responses here give us an idea of the ways we can bring Texans from different threads to the table when talking about the future of the state. For example, the majority of Texans do believe that, regardless of faiths, race, backgrounds, people want to feel like they can belong in the state. So the question we can think about is, how do we integrate the vision on diversity and belonging with some of those values of tradition when you look at, the support for a Texas that upholds traditional values across Reverend Texans and heritage defenders on the slide. So I hope that gave you at least a small snapshot of the findings and research insights in our Threads of Texas report, and I hope that it can inform your work. So with that, I can pass it over to my colleague Coco to talk through some of our message testing.
Thank you, Paul. And as Dan described at the start of the presentation, the Threads of Texas project is not just a research study, but also a blueprint for impact and communications guidance. It included insights from our message testing component, where we tested messages on 4 key themes: immigration, race, education, and democracy and civic engagement. And when it comes to More in Common's general hypotheses on communication strategy, we believe that the narrative landscape on which all policy debates play out among the public is often defined by perceptions of group identities and also attitudes towards change. We also work with different partners and organizations to equip them with insights on how to talk about issue areas in ways that resonate across lines of differences, and also in ways that build a shared sense of belonging. We hope to craft messages that highlight our shared values, foster conditions where the target audience is most receptive to new information, that might challenge their assumptions or old thinking, and also to encourage reflection. As you can see here, this is our message testing methodology, step by steps. But prior to crafting messages, we first consulted findings from academic literature and past research findings. Based on our segmentation study, we first identified the target audiences, so which are the threads we're trying to speak to. Then we looked at their core beliefs and the values that the Texas threads endorse most strongly. And core beliefs are the framework that we use to look at moral foundations, which means the fundamental values that are often the underlying drivers of people's views and attitudes on different issue areas. And after examining their core beliefs, we then analyze the target audience's thoughts on key issues and also their shared Texan identity, which Paul just described earlier, such as the beliefs in freedom, liberty, but also diversity and neighborliness. Finally, based on all these data points, we created overarching messages that emphasize shared Texan values and also adopt perspectives and phrases that speak to the target audience's worldviews and values. And before showing you one of our messages, we want to emphasize that the process is meant to test broad templates rather than specific line item issues and phrases. And now we can quickly look at one message that performed well across different audiences. But if you're interested in the other messages and themes we tested, please feel free to reach out to us. And here is a message that we tested on the topic of democracy and civic engagement, which played on the idea of civic participation as both a right and a responsibility. This spiderweb-looking graph on the right shows the average agreement scores for the message, with higher spikes indicating higher agreement from the corresponding segments. And the message, the text we tested, is here on the left, and the highlighted phrases correspond to the Texan identities or core beliefs. This message reiterates the shared Texan belief in freedom and equality, and also urges Texans to talk with neighbors and people with different views. You can see on the right in the spiderweb-looking graph, this message was overall effective, but except for apolitical providers who did not resonate well with the call for civic participation and dialogue as they are busy with their day-to-day life. So what are the implications of our message testing component? First of all, we learned that messages that explicitly acknowledge competing ideas and share elements of Texas identity are well received by most Texas threads. Secondly, it highlights the importance of knowing your audience. As you can remember, the variation in agreement scores among different Texas threads shows that it is essential to be deliberate and intentional about the elements of the message, including both the values or language that might engender diverse reactions, but also shared aspects of a common identity that the audience can agree on. Lastly, while political identities are powerful drivers of attitudes on policy issues, as we all know, they're not the only identities that are relevant. Social identities, such as being a parent, being a neighbor, and being Texan, are also powerful drivers of attitudes and behaviors. And with that, I'll pass it back to Paul.
Great, and I think I just have maybe 2 slides to finish up here, but what we'd like to provide at the end here is a case study for how we recommend using our information from our study. So I'm going to offer a scenario example of a step-by-step guide on how organizations can follow this methodology and incorporate our findings into their own messaging strategies, from first identifying target audiences to exploring core beliefs and shared identity, and eventually bringing these findings in to inform a campaign. So in the summer of 2021, our organization worked with the San Antonio chapter of YWCA to help the organization understand the existing research and issue framing for wage equity in Texas. So More in Common worked with YWCA to think about how audience messaging might matter and how the issue resonates with the ideologically diverse landscape of Texans. So More in Common presented data on how this specific issue might resonate with some Texans and tried to understand how the threads of Texas and their perceptions of an issue campaign like this matters. So I think really the first step here was to work with YWCA's team to understand their audience, and they really wanted to reach a specific thread, which was Reverend Texans, and they sought to understand this specific group for their campaign. And the next step was sort of to look at the core beliefs of this group and values of this thread, which include optimism, pride, and religiosity. After that, we looked at some of the more specific views on issues across this group. So we explored, gender equality and survey questions from our large-scale research on, if men have advantages over women. So really what we hope to do is understand and help YWCA understand how Reverend Texans perceive an issue like this, especially for a campaign focused on this issue. And after that, we looked at the shared values that the specific thread Reverend Texans have with other Texans. So about 7 in 10 believe that they're more grateful for their family in the past year. And 9 in 10 think that when they think of Texas, they think of its global economy and successful businesses and entrepreneurs. So these core values can help build a shared narrative of Texas and can be integrated into an outreach campaign on specific issues to improve resonance and reach across ideologically diverse audiences. And finally, just simply informing a campaign. So using our existing messaging findings to create shared narratives that resonate with groups like Reverend Texans. So baking into these messages core values and beliefs such as neighborliness, fairness, freedom, and loyalty. So we can go to the next slide. And this is just part of our research project was talking with key stakeholders in Texas. And that's anyone from leaders in the agricultural industry to people from business and tech and the arts. So these are just 2 quotes that we wanted to end with, which the first one is from someone from the Environmental Justice Organization, talking about how reaching local Texas audiences is important. And David here says that they try to stay away from the rhetoric of the left, of environmentalists, but focus on the rhetoric of neighborhood associations and applying community organizing techniques. And then the quote on the right there is from George, who's a leader in the agricultural industry in Texas, and talks about integrating tech into sectors, thinking about how, tech and agriculture are not mutually exclusive, and there are points of commonality in creating a diverse economy in Texas can lead to powerful and positive change. So I think with that, I know we got a few questions in the chat, so I can just sort of kick it over to Dan or Noel or my team to handle those one by one.
Great. Thanks, Paul. And we're excited to dive in now and eager for folks' questions. I think the first one we got was a question. I'm just going to restate them. Is what is the difference between die-hard Texans and heritage defenders? And so it's an interesting question. And I think I'll provide kind of 2 points and then invite Noel, Paul, and Coco to weigh in. The first is the intensity of political affiliation. So heritage defenders their political identity is about as strong an identity as they hold. Their Texas identity probably is their strongest one, but very, very, very intensely political. If you look at the calendars of a heritage defender and a diehard Texan, they would look radically different. So a heritage defender would have political events, it would have shows that are political in orientation and kind of conservative in their ideology. A heritage defender would have a bunch of family and community events, and they'd be watching television shows that are just much more kind of mainstream, less political, cooking, shopping, etc. So their intensity of their political engagement is substantially different. And then the other difference that I would highlight is an attitude, which is the heritage defenders feel under attack. They actively feel as if the things they value are being eroded and taken away from them and their society. And so they are willing to engage with a much higher level of intensity and aggression. Whereas diehard defenders are fundamentally optimistic about the future. They love Texas. They think Texas is going to get better. They don't like a lot of the things they see in politics, but the amount of time that they spend looking at politics is so much less. So there is a much happier, more optimistic kind of scene of Texas that they see. I think those are two important distinctions. But Noel, Coco, Paul, anything else to add on to that one?
No, I think that's it. The fundamental starting point for diehard Texans is one from a positive place of pride and optimism. And from heritage defenders, it's just this negative orientation that Dan described.
Okay, so the second question we received was, we seem to be quite diverging between left and right. Do you anticipate we'll ever see eye to eye on salient Commonwealth issues that impact all of us? It's a great question, and it connects to another question that we received about the possibility for a third party. Because I think when we consider seeing eye to eye, like what our data shows actually is that most Texans, there's a lot more agreement already in society than we would commonly think. But importantly, there is a significant distinction, and we show that over and over again, between, say, Lone Star Progressives and heritage defenders. There's no real daylight between those threads on most issues. So then the question becomes, like, who's actively engaged in politics? Who's actually the voices and the actors that are shaping our perceptions of people's views and actively shaping how certain issues break out in legislation, in courts, in all of the ways in which we adjudicate opinion in a democracy. And that's where you see a sharp distinction. So in this research, we did general population. So we didn't only look at registered voters or active voters. We captured that information because we know it's really important. And in Texas, there's a sizable difference between who votes in Texas and the broader Texan society. So in the broader Texas society, there's a lot more agreement already. And we saw that in the energy crisis and the weather crisis in March, a lot more people recognizing the interdependency at the local level, say. But it's also true that when you have a population that is participating in politics that is not as representative of the whole society, you then see a politics that is much more influenced by subpopulations. And that's where I think Texas, there's much less common ground currently. And so our hope is to try and help provide this more complex map to see where there might be spaces to start to shift and reduce the distinction and the difference between political Texas and Texas society more generally. Noel, Coco, Paul, anything on that one?
Nothing to add except something that one of our interviewees said. And I think this was someone from the arts industry, where he said, sometimes he feels like it's not eye to eye that's the goal anymore. He'll be happy just to look in the same direction and see the same thing. And so I think there's also that shared vision and sort of shared reality question that's important.
That is a great point, Noel. And I think we captured this in the research. We just didn't share it today as much as people's media consumption is increasingly divergent among the politically engaged threads as well. So there is that very real reality of people not sharing a common set of assumptions or facts. Okay, the next question we got was, what are your thoughts on the potential rise of a third political party in Texas, or perhaps moving to multiple parties to break down these left-right issues? So we work with a lot of partners across the ideological spectrum on a number of issues. And so we have a number of partners who work on things like ranked choice voting, gerrymandering reform, where they're trying to think of multi-member districts and some of the redistricting options, independent redistricting commissions, et cetera. I think that there's a lot of structural impediments to the rise of a third party in Texas, just as there is in the country writ large. But I'm not an expert in that, so I would kind of hesitate. And we also didn't engage a lot in that research, so I don't want to speak beyond our research. I think that there's another way that we think about how do you change political structures, and this is what kind of Paul alluded to in that last slide, which is increasingly in Texas and the country writ large, state politics is becoming a mirror of the national politics, or that it's becoming much more nationalized. And so what sorts of institutions can help build more localized political actors and agents and keep the focus at the more local level, where there might be greater pockets to bring in, for example, diehard Texans. Like diehard Texans is a thread that's not very politically engaged, and so they're not likely to be mobilized as much around a statewide movement to reform or change democracy, for example, but might be engaged if the lens is community or local or that kind of more place-centered movement. And so that's what More in Common's research speaks more to, is the desire for those more localized connections and sense of agency within a place that has the institutions and framework that someone like a diehard Texan would engage with. I don't know if others on the team have okay. Next question was, what about generational differences? Are younger or older people falling on specific buckets? I think we have a slide on this, actually. So, Coco, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Anne. And Noel, if you can share slide 43, which shows the generational background. And while we wait for Noel, I'd like to say that, as you can remember, the demographic information was not used in our segmentation process. But as you can see from this graph, there are some generational differences when it comes to different segments. For example, for Rising Mavericks, 66%, which are 2/3 of the segment, are Gen Z Texans. But when you look at Reverend Texans or Heritage Defenders, there are a higher percentage of baby boomers and silent generation. But on the other hand, we want to emphasize that, as you can see from this graph, there's a pretty diverse breakdown of each generation across all the Texas threads. So we want to highlight that beyond demographic information, it is the attitudes toward change and also the perception toward the future, and whether there is a sense of loss or a sense of optimism that animate differences in views, and that's what leads to the segmentation. And team, any other thoughts on this question?
There's another question on the urban-rural divide. And just also to say that if any of you are interested in these data points, we have it in this 100 slide deck, but we only showed 35 of the slides, but we have all the demographic breakdowns. And so I think this is the urban-rural breakdown. And so about 1/3 of urban, at least for each group, with a bit lower for Reverend Texans and Heritage Defenders. And then you'll see how Lone Star Progressives majority are suburban, actually. And yeah. And also, again, to Coco's point about the generational differences, this variable was not in our segmentation, but what we find, and even in our focus groups, right, like it's where they are geographically might inform the way they view the changes happening, and also what the changes mean for them personally for their future.
And then we have two final questions that are related. So one asked, there are some recent books on Texas exceptionalism and how this mentality may limit our ability to think progressively and inclusively. Any perspective on this? And then similarly, if Texas exceptionalism at the core is what preventing us in Texas from accepting that our history and current data signals significant opportunities for improvement vis-a-vis equity, inclusion, justice, et cetera. Question. So question on Texas exceptionalism. And those are phenomenal questions that I think strike at really the core of this research project in many ways. And so I just want to offer first that answering in a few minutes is going to fail to capture the full complexity of what we might respond. But I initially might want to say that there is a lot of validity to the idea that Texas exceptionalism has this particular narrative that is profoundly strong among a lot of Texans, and it's somewhat narrow and informed by a particular version of history and of an education and cultural context which reinforces those points. And it might be inhibiting when people think of Texas exceptionalism that doesn't encompass, for example, the full diversity of the state as it exists today, or some of the opportunities to make improvements around issues of equity. I hesitate to think that means that the solution then is to try and only elevate the ways in which the narrative Texas exceptionalism fails, primarily because a lot of groups seek that kind of story for positive reasons. They find themselves situated within this story of exceptionalism and of aspirations that have a lot of meaning for folks like Hard Texans, for Rising Mavericks, et cetera. And it doesn't preclude the idea that we can introduce more complex narratives. We can reframe the context of things like race and slavery in Texas's history. It is most powerfully done probably at the local level, where folks can reframe it themselves in the context of neighbors and a place. But I think that there's also a lot of power to keeping a Texas exceptionalism narrative insofar as it has a lot of meaning for folks that are less engaged in politics currently. And it's a matter of how do we reframe that where it can capture positive elements of neighborliness, of great accomplishments, of being able to kind of go against the trend that maybe other places are going, while introducing the failures and the flaws of Texas's history and present, and finding a way to make it such that it's a point of pride among Texans that we address issues of inequality because we are unafraid of doing the things that others are afraid of doing. Something like that might be a more palatable message for groups that adhere to a very strong Texas exceptionalism narrative. Noel, Coco, Paul, anything to add on that as we close out?
Nothing else. It's a great question because it's a question that constantly came up while we did this research, and especially as we present. So actually would love to continue that conversation. And that ties into my closing. I just want to show where you can find all these findings and the slides from this presentation. We are happy to share out. But importantly, if you have any more questions or are interested in collaborating or just meeting with the team, please contact us, and Julia will be the point of contact, but hoping for more future conversations with everyone. Thank you.
Wow, just wow. If you can imagine that we are going to be surrounded by these kinds of brilliant thought leaders all week long. We are so grateful to the two previous panels and the conversations that we have had already this morning. We're going to be taking a 30-minute break. Come back at 10:30. We will be featuring the first artist that we feature this week will be Truth to Power. We are thrilled to have the arts involved in our week-long conversation, in our week-long Big Bang. We will be having a fascinating porch-side conversation about the digital divide with Armando Cantu and our own SVP Dallas partner, Roy Lopez, who is with the Federal Reserve, one of our co-producers. At 11 a.m., we will have a fascinating keynote with Majora Carter, and that session will be moderated by our own SVP partner and board member and board chair-elect, Kimberly O'Neill. And it is supported by Bank of America. So once again, we are so grateful to have you involved with us this week. We look forward to seeing you in about 30 minutes, and we hope to see you all week long. Thank you.